The following is the heart-wrenching story of one of the most brutal shark attacks of the last 2 decades, and a tale of incredible courage displayed by a father attempting to save his son's life against all odds. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying shark attack of David Peltier. Welcome to Final Affliction. It was September 1st, 2001. The United States was in the grip of fear after hundreds of shark-related deaths over the course of just a few months had made everyone uneasy about visiting beaches or surfing in the water. Species like the bull shark had become notorious for their danger to humans. These sharks can grow up to 9 feet and are considered one of the most aggressive species of all. With jaws that can gape open up to 20 inches, revealing heavily serrated teeth, these sharks are even known to be cannibalistic, eating their own kind as well as other species. The summer of the shark, as those few months later became known, now seemed to be coming to an end. But the victims of these shark attacks left terrifying tales in their wake, including the tragic demise of a 10-year-old boy who had been mercilessly mauled to death in July by a bull shark in the shallow waters of a Florida beach. For 10-year-old David Peltier and his 2 brothers, Robert and Josh, summer vacations were ending and the next school term was about to start in just a few days. The 3 young boys missed the long and warm summer days and wanted to visit the beach one last time before the fall set in. The boys' father, Richard Peltier, decided that the Sandbridge Beach, about 5 miles south of Virginia Beach, was the perfect place to spend a relaxing Saturday afternoon. It was a popular vacation spot with shallow waters and warm sand, and they had generally enjoyed their time at the beach earlier that year. The boys loved the beach, and the shallow water meant that it was safe to tread a few feet closer to the shore and feel the wet sand beneath their feet. The ocean seemed calm and clear, and young David would often stop to admire the small dogfish that would swim up close to the shore. After relaxing and some light surfing, a few hours had passed. Richard had surfed enough and decided to remove the tether to his longboard and attach it to David's surfboard. At this point, they had gone more than 50 yards into the water, but it was still just 4 feet deep. Richard's other 2 sons were just 10 feet away, and the sea looked calm with the occasional light waves. It was a safe environment to teach the young boys how to surf and balance in the water by themselves. Or so he thought. Richard sent off his son David just a few feet further into the water, and that's when he felt some commotion beneath the water. He looked down and he saw what sent shivers of terror down his spine. In the flowing water below, he could make out the figure of a shark about 8 feet long. Then, as it swam closer to the surface, he saw the dreaded fin. The horrifying sight, combined with the fact that his children were still several feet away from his reach, was enough to turn the warm summer afternoon into a living nightmare. Immediately, he screamed at the top of his lungs for his boys to get back on their surfboards and frantically made his way to 10-year-old David to try and drag him back to safety. But then, as he held David's arm, he felt a strong tug from the other side. The boy let out a scream in agony as the shark bit into his thigh, trying to pull him deep into the water to be devoured. Richard realized he was now locked in a cynical tug-of-war against a sea monster, and between them was his own son. The shark refused to let go and began shaking its head left and right to try and chew off a bite of the little boy. Richard, his wet grip slipping off of his son's arm, did everything he could to save his son, even at the cost of his own life. He put his right hand between the shark's jaws and tried to loosen its grip. The animal then bit down with greater force and managed to tear off the child's entire leg. Richard hit the shark as hard as he could on its head and even punched its eyes to try and throw it off. Momentarily pacified, the shark swam back to the ocean with David's limb. Richard gathered his senses and realized that his son was bleeding profusely. He picked him up and tried to swim back 50 yards to the shore as fast as he could. With an ever-present danger of the shark returning, those 50 yards felt like 50 miles as he carried his son on his shoulders back to safety. The beachgoers had realized that something had gone terribly wrong, and the rescuers had reached the scene by the time they made it back to sand. Richard finally made it to solid ground and spotted his other 2 sons crying and screaming for their brother, who was unconscious and losing blood fast. Every passing second now was heavy on little David's life. He was slipping away, held in his father's hands. Richard, crying and pleading for help, tried to revive his son. The shark, with its gaping 17-inch jaw opening, had torn into one of the biggest arteries in his thigh, and no lifeguards at the scene were able to stop the rapid bleeding. An ambulance had arrived at the scene by this time, and Richard hurried him in to save his life. The father had now realized the gravity of the event, and for the first time thought that he might actually be witnessing the death of his beloved son before his very eyes. David was rushed into one hospital after another. The bleeding had been controlled, but the amount that he had already lost put him in dire straits. The following was a long night for Richard. He sat beside his son at the hospital bed at the Children's Hospital of King's Daughters, pleading to God to save his son's life. At 4 a.m. the next morning, David's life finally slipped away, and he died from the massive amount of blood lost from his missing leg. The tragic incident sent shockwaves throughout America and revived fears about shark attacks. The beach was closed briefly the next day, but reopened after helicopter surveillance declared the area free of sharks. But nothing could bring back the life of 10-year-old David, who in his last moments awake witnessed the pure terror of being torn to pieces by an aquatic beast. Professionals thought that the shark was a sandbar species native to the Atlantic Ocean, but a report a month later claimed that it was a bull shark, identified by its fin and its proclivity to swim in shallower waters. The species is known to be highly aggressive and for tearing away the flesh from its prey with violent movements of the head. The tragedy haunted Richard for many years afterwards, and the memory of his son moves him to tears whenever he thinks of the events of that fateful day. It's always important to understand the risks involved while entering the domain of these super predators. To them, it's just lunch, but for many people each year, it's the day they meet their final affliction.